when you approach a restoration, sure, there's guidelines, but nothing is written in stone. Every instrument is different. It's basically you have to look at the problem and, again, analyze it, give your options, and then make a decision on the best option and hope for the best. We're generally very successful. We're not dealing necessarily with life and death. You're not on an operating table with a human being, but still you're dealing in a multifaceted venue, when you're doing restoration, and the fact that, not only are you restoring structurally this instrument back whole, but you also have to restore tonally. So it's a dual purpose. It's not just making the instrument look great or closing a crack, but you have to make certain that instrument functions. We're dealing, I've said it often, it's functional art. That's what we deal with.
There's nothing like sitting down over a decade later to do a round two conversation with somebody with the wealth of knowledge and experience like today's guest. Oh, so glad to bring you today's conversation. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and we are chatting today with none other than Barrie Kolstein, who is coming up on 50 years in the bass business. Whoa! Additionally, the Kolstein and Sons, his father Samuel Kolstein started that company. They are celebrating their 70th anniversary. They've been in Baldwin, New York for years and years and years. We're in New York City before that. And, Barrie and I actually got into that in a wonderful conversation, like I mentioned earlier, over 10 years ago at this point, with John Grillo. So definitely go back and check that out if you haven't. But today we cover all kinds of new ground, like what it was like working with some of these bass legends like Fred Zimmermann and Orin O'Brien, new product innovations like silicon rosin cases, Barrie's Busetto bass, new flight trunk designs, how the bass world has and hasn't changed, advice Barrie would give to his younger self, and much more. And I would like to, before we dive in, give a shout out to our sponsors. By the way, one of them is Kolstein Music, and also D'Addario Strings, Steve Swan String Bass, and Upton Bass. More on all of them later. Let's dig into this conversation with Barrie Kolstein. So I'm here with Barrie Kolstein at Kolstein in Baldwin, New York. It's great to be here. And this year is the 75th anniversary of the
actual
business?
Inception of the business.
Okay.
Welcome, Jason. It's a pleasure to have you visit the shop.
Well, it's long overdue.
Well, you know what? We've discussed that it's over 10 years ago. We did our last conversation, and that was with John Grillo via telephone.
Yep.
So this is so much nicer to be sitting here and just talking directly with you.
Yeah, and it's for sure. And so 75th anniversary of the business, and then Barrie was just telling me next year or in a year and a half or so, you'll be 50 years in the business.
Yeah, that's hard to believe itself. Am I really that old?
Well, and we're walking back here, and Barrie's showing me this wall, and it's a who's who in the bass world. It's from David Walter. We're looking at Milt Hinton,
Homer Mensch,
and
Slam Stewart. You have Major Holly. Percy Heath.
Right.
So many greats. I've been very blessed in my life to have so many of these great people come into my life, and I don't even consider the blessing that they were clients of mine, the blessing they were such good friends and family.
And you're showing me these basses too, this tremendous Prescott, the history of some of these basses. Can you tell the story of that the bass, Louis Armstrong's bassist?
Yeah, Arvell Shore. Yeah.
Okay, Barrie told me this great story about this. It's an unbelievable Prescott, but can you?
I'd be happy to. Yeah, no, Arvell was a client of mine for many, many years. He was a client of my dad's, and back in the late 50s, he actually gave up his beautiful Prescott, which is a very famous bass. It's well documented. It's actually in the movie High Society, which was a movie that I think it was done in 1956 with Bing Crosby and Louis Armstrong and a whole bunch of other great, actors and performers. Louis was in that movie and Arvell performed, and that bass was well shown in it. In fact, I often say that, the opening of that movie shows Louis Armstrong with a band in a bus and Arvell sitting in a seat with a bass, and I'm saying, there is no way that bass this is a real bus, because that bass would never fit into the bus. Yeah. But Arvell had told me the story that back in the 1950s, when he was working with Louis, I guess Louis had a situation that he always had a designated time period. I'm not certain what it was. It could have been 120 minutes, 90 minutes for his sets. And basically, contractors were always trying to get him to shorten the sets so he could do 3 shows instead of 2 shows a night. And Louis refused to do that because he really felt he was known for that period of time that he performed. But somehow it was a show in France that he was actually allowed it to happen. He acquiesced. Maybe the money was so good. I'm not sure why, but he shortened the set. And basically it was in a ballroom setting with back doors and front doors to the ballroom. And Louis performed, and I guess he finished what he was the designated time. And they opened the front ballroom doors to let the audience out. And then, unfortunately, they opened the back doors to let the next group in, and the first group refused to leave. They said they were shortchanged in their performance. And actually, it really got to be very serious, that a riot broke out, that a lot of people were hurt. And at that point, Orville came to my father, and he says, you need to take this bass because this Prescott almost cost me my life. And in fact, when I actually restored this bass, maybe about 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago, whatever it was, it actually had a hole in the side where a wine bottle had hit it. And on it, but fantastic bass. But the truth of the matter is that Orville always missed that bass. But as he got older, he had some physical restraints, and he couldn't handle it. It's a bass for definitely a specific person. Great sounding, though.
Yeah, anybody who's ever been around a Prescott bass, I mean, sort of knows the size of what these basses can be. This is a tremendous instrument, and that's not the only Prescott here. You get the great, and Barrie and I were just chatting about Prescott and the history, and refresh my memory. Early 19th century, Prescott was active.
He was actually late. I believe it was from the late 1700s to the early 1800s.
Yeah.
He really didn't make that basses that long a period of time. He was really truly a businessman. Prescott, to the best of my knowledge, was not really a maker. He was more of a business person. He had some great makers, family people in there, that worked in the shop. But he made everything from barrels to umbrellas to basses to cellos. I have a Prescott cello in my vault right now. He also, once the organ was developed, they stopped making basses and it became a piano and organ factory. But Prescott was quite an individual. He was known in the church as a deacon, even though he wasn't part of the church. He was so entrenched in the church on a business aspect. And basically, it explained to you that, when he moved his shop from Deerfield, New Hampshire to Concord, New Hampshire, he suffered 2 fires. And after the second fire, he did have insurance and felt the insurance business was so good that he got out of the Prescott business as far as instrument making and became an insurance agent for the rest of his life. So, very interesting man.
And now he also made church basses?
Yes, he did.
Okay, and I'm always a little bit confused by what were those used for? What was the?
Well, it was prior to the organ really becoming part of in the church, and again, it was a church-driven type of situation why these instruments were created. But you had the choir, and you had basically a bass, and the conventional basses were just too loud for the choir, so they created these church basses, these smaller basses. When orchestras became reorchestrated and introduced the bass in as a member of the orchestra, the lowest member of the string, which the cello was prior to that, they reorchestrated all the major symphony orchestras. That's why basses really follow the cello part. And it's one of the reasons why the bass is called the double bass. Why? Because it doubles the cello. And at that point, Prescott said, this is a good business. And he started creating, 3/4 size gamba-shaped Prescotts, and then the big 7/8 size Busetto Prescott models.
And like I was saying, the beautiful basses, they'll very enormous instruments, many of them, and you pick them up and you can just feel the size and the scale of these. And then there's also the thing that the Prescott, the F holes,
jointed F holes,
right?
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
And that's because the top Prescotts are notoriously thin in the middle.
They were. I mean, there used to be. I remember my father used to say that restoring a Prescott separates the men from the boys in the restoration business, because it's really one of the most complex restorations. Most Prescotts never had neck blocks. They were what were called integrated tailed necks that had the ribs set into the neck, so there wasn't a neck block to allow you to elevate. So very often, in most cases, you had to not only restore the top, add wood into the center section, which was called generally a breast patch, new bass bars to regulate, so you evened out the instruments. Prescotts were always, very bottom end, huge bottoms, lacking on the top end. When they're properly restored, everything evens out. You have quite a magnificent instrument. As far as the neck blocks go, it usually entails installing a neck block, doing a neck graft on the neck itself to allow the necks to be elevated to proper pitch and elevation.
I wonder why he built them that way with the integrated neck block. Was that common, or is it?
You know what? It was common as far as a Germanistic, type of. You found a lot of integrated or tailed necks, done in some of the German, some of the Marknenkirch and Southern German instruments, some of the Prague or the Czechoslovakian or Bohemian instruments. So, a lot of that was copied because, the Busetto corners was the original design was from, I believe it was Mario del Busetto, who was the inventor of those corners. Mm-hmm. And then it came into Klotz corners, which were used heavily. And then Prescott actually copied some of the German workmanship.
And you brought up the word Busetto, and your Busetto line of basses. You don't call them travel basses. Sort of shifting gears here, although they are used for. So last summer, we're talking in 2018 here. Last summer at ISB 2017, I came down and was playing on one of these basses. It was the first time I got a chance to play on the Busetto and Barrie's model, and I was just blown away by the sound that this gets, because the body of the instrument is quite small.
It is smaller. Basically the premise of that bass when I decided to design it was to create as high a quality carved, or actually a real bass, not a laminate bass, not a stick bass. Mm-hmm. This is a truly carved, hand carved instrument that was modeled after when I had the bass here, the Scott LaFaro's Prescott, mm-hmm. and I basically redimensionalized that bass. And it happens to work. We've made some modifications since the inception of the design. We increased the rib depth, but we didn't want to increase the size of travel purposes. We've also designed it now that it comes with a solid neck design, or it comes with a removable neck design. It's really worked well. We've had such a phenomenal run with it, and it's really catching on. People are loving the quality of it. They're loving, the fact that this is a real bass. You're not selling yourself short to play on this instrument. So much so that, as you mentioned, we took the word travel out of it. It is great for travel, but in 99% of the instances where people acquire this instrument, they basically, they use it as much as they use their own. One of the best examples, or two best examples, are Charnett Moffat, who's such an amazing player. He really relies. He owns two of them and doesn't even rarely relies upon a conventional instrument. And Miroslav Vitwas, he basically hasn't touched his Homolka bass in almost 10 years since he got the Busetto. He fondly calls it his Ferrari of double basses, which is funny.
Well, they're great. They're great instruments. They sound great. Portable. They're selling very well, it sounds like. And
we're having fun with it.
Yeah,
it's really a fun
bet.
run with this.
I'll bet.
It's basically I get a very big kick on seeing, the high level of players that are using this bass and believe in it. It's just wonderful.
And you modeled the acoustics on the Scott LaFaro
Scotty's bass,
okay. Which you have a long association with that bass.
Long time, yeah. It's that bass goes back. Scotty found that bass. I shouldn't even say Scotty found it. Red Mitchell found that bass at Stein on the Vine Music out in California, in Hollywood, I believe it is, and called Scotty because Scotty had, I believe, his German bass had been stolen, and Scotty flew out to the West Coast and saw the bass, loved the design of it, loved the size of it, didn't love the sound of it. Mm-hmm. And he brought it back to New York. He purchased the instrument, brought it back to New York. And at that point, I think he was doing some sort of Gunter Schuller, a project that involved a lot of bass players. And De Vivier was on that project and basically met Scotty at that point, and Scotty, tried the bass, and he says, you need to come out and meet Sam Kolstein. And he brought Scotty out to meet my father. My father often tells the story, or told me the story, that that he basically, George came into his shop at that point, and the showroom was out in another part, and which he couldn't see, and he heard this young man playing, heard someone playing, and he kind of looked at George and said, what is that? And who is that? And he just fell in love with Scotty. I remember at that point of my father's career, his shop was in his home in Merrick. He had a very large ranch house on the water, which a lot of people remember. The whole basement of the shop was dedicated, or the whole basement of the house was dedicated to his shop. And, Scotty used to come out regularly. I was kind of young, and that's one of my regrets in life, is that, not that I wanted myself older than what I was now, but I wish I had enough sense to really realize who was in my... I remember him coming to the house, often having dinner with us, because Gloria, his girlfriend, lived in Seaford, New York, which was a town away from us, or 2 towns away from where the shop was, so he would often come out to visit her. So we saw him quite often at that time, but I just, I was too young to really appreciate everything that was going on. But my father restored the bass for Scotty at that point, and unfortunately, with Scotty's passing, the bass was, in the car when Scotty passed away, very badly damaged, and my father acquired it from Mrs. LaFaro, Scotty's mother, promising that the bass would be restored at one time. Mm-hmm. And it took a long time. My father never had the heart. It basically stayed in the shop in Merrick until we moved to the shop here in 1980. And what precipitated really the restoration was the ISB convention in 1988 at UCLA that was dedicated to Fred Zimmermann and Scott LaFaro. And 2 years prior to that, I kind of went to my father and I said, Dad, I think it's time that we restored this bass. And he said, you do it. Mm-hmm. And, it took me almost a year and a half to restore that bass. It was pretty comprehensive. And fortunately, we did document it because there was no digital. It wasn't the digital era back then. Right. But I had written an article for the ISB, and actually, when Helene wrote her book on a brother, we were able to actually digitally improve those photographs and use it again, so it's part of her book. But it was an interesting venture. It really was. And the bass, it was with me up until maybe 4 years ago.
And does it reside at Ithaca College now?
It was. I made the decision back then because this was an instrument that weighed heavily on me, what to do with this instrument. It was an easy decision and a hard decision. The hard decision was not having the bass here, not seeing it every day. The easy decision was that, was to endow it to the ISB. Mm-hmm. And the ISB in turn put it at Ithaca College, where there's a living archive to Scott LaFaro, which Nick Walker put together. Amazing guy.
And it was great to be able to check that out at the convention in Ithaca last year, and it's great that it resides there. It's what a great place for it to be. And
plus, it's nice. I get visitation rights usually once a year, so it comes back here for me to check it over. But I'm very pleased with my decision. I love the fact where it is. It couldn't be in a better place. And you know what? A lot of people are getting to play on it, and you see the bass. It's a legacy. It's an extension of Scott LaFaro.
Yeah. When I was recently chatting with Gary and Eric of Upton Bass, I asked them, how did they do what they do? How do they build their presence and be so top of mind among bassists around the world? Here's what they said.
My ego doesn't want to say this, right? And Eric's won't like it either. But because of the timing, we couldn't do again what we've done.
Yeah. And what they have done is absolutely extraordinary. From their beginnings as an accessories shop online to now making over 120 basses a year. They're coming up, as I record this, on 1,700 basses. They've got an army of satisfied customers who bought multiple basses. They're just really doing great things. They do great work and stand behind their products. Check them out at uptonbass.com. And thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast, guys. This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Strings. Our friends at D'Addario want to help listeners change their strings safely and efficiently, and they have a few tricks to help you achieve that. Each time the string winds around the peg, be sure that it lays neatly next to the previous coil as opposed to crossing over itself, which increases the risk of breaking. Wind each string from the middle of the peg outward, making sure never to rub up against the peg box wall, which also increases risk of breakage. Learn more at orchestral.d'addario.com, and thank you so much for sponsoring the podcast. Well, and speaking of basses coming back and visiting, we were just walking back here, Barrie and I, and we saw a bass that your father made, Sam Kolstein, that is now owned by Jeff Turner, but was originally made for Fred Zimmermann.
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Tell folks just about. I mean, what a great journey that bass has had.
This was actually the very first Panormo, Vincenzo Panormo copy that my father made, and it was intended to go to Fred. Sam Hollingsworth, had left playing for a period of time. Sam was probably one of the most amazing individuals, a great player, great educator, great individual, great man. And he decided to return, and he decided that he was going to do a town hall recital, and the instrument that he had at that time, he felt wasn't right for him. And at that point, Fred had just taken delivery on the Panormo bass, and really we worked it out that that the bass would go to Sam instead, which Sam won the Pittsburgh audition on. He did very well. It was his bass up until his retirement. And I often say it went from principal of the Pittsburgh to principal of the Pittsburgh, because Jeff ended up here. So it's in here for some TLC right now.
And Barrie studied with Fred Zimmermann.
I did,
along with so many other people. And I was just thinking, there's so much we could talk about. Barrie and I talked along with John Grillo for a couple hours back a decade ago. It was
fun.
We scratched you covered 0.1% of what we could talk about. But I was thinking, you look at all the people that you worked with over the years, let alone the people that have come in the shop and you've worked with there, but just you on the bass, these people. And I'd love to hear, maybe we could just go through some of these legends in the bass world that you got the chance to study with, and any memories from time spent with them. Like Fred Zimmermann, I know that you studied with him and then he got ill.
Yes,
right?
I did.
Right.
I was a senior in high school.
Okay. What was he like? What are some memories?
Anybody that knew Fred would say he was one of a kind. I mean, the man was probably the most talented, the most giving. Mm-hmm. He was the most interesting. Not only was he an amazing teacher, an amazing performer, he was an amazing artist also. He was truly a great artist. He was part of this shop wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Fred Zimmermann. Fred, just to digress a little bit, when my father also studied, my father went off to Juilliard as a piano major. And as a piano major, you had to choose another instrument. My father always loved bass, and he chose bass and was fortunate enough to get Fred as his teacher as well. And Fred, my father went into the military during World War II. He was in special services stationed at Fort Hamilton, but because he was married, he was allowed to live off base. And at that point, he was driving around, and I guess he was transporting some people to a gig in his car, and someone sat on his German bow.
Oh.
And broke the bow. And my father didn't have much money, to replace it. So he took it around to some of the great, the makers that were available at that time. Everybody said, you can't repair it. It has to be replaced. My father had an engineering background and basically looked at the bow and said, this can be repaired. And he repaired it, showed it to Fred, and Fred said, this is amazing work, Sam. And he turned around and he had a bass that literally, it was a Barzoni bass that had been destroyed in an accident, literally was in bags. Mm-hmm. And he said, he handed it to my father. He said, see what you can do with this, Sam. Father didn't have a shop. He had a small apartment in Brooklyn and worked in the kitchen to restore this for months, figuring out what to do with it. And he brought the bass back to Fred, and Fred said, this is even more amazing. And he said, you know what, you're a great musician, Sam, but he says, you're missing your calling. You should be going into repair. You're offering something that didn't exist at the time for bass repairman. You were giving these same respect that the violin repairman gave to their instruments, where a lot of the work that was done on basses back then, it was carpentry work. And he changed that around. And at that point, Fred not only encouraged him to do it, but sent people his way, helped him, whatever. And that's how the business, began. He basically opened the business due to Fred Zimmermann. My time with Fred was amazing. I spent a little over a year with him. And, people like Don Palmer was studying with Fred at that time. We were all, study mates at that point. Yeah. Everybody will attest he was one in a million. When Fred passed away, it kind of took the heart out of playing, and I left playing from maybe, when I went off to college. I really didn't play until probably my senior year in college, that I went to Albany, and the Dr. Gottschalk, who was the music professor, found that there was a Zimmermann student, and he kind of sought me out to play in the orchestra. And at that point, I started playing. I got bitten again, and I came back and decided to go with Orin, and I studied with Orin for 2.5 years, which was a complete smooth transition from Zimmermann training to Orin O'Brien training.
Well, because wasn't she a Fred Zimmermann student?
She was a prodigy student of Fred's.
Yeah. And she has so many fond memories. I chatted with Orin. We're talking about Orin O'Brien. I'm sure everybody knows who we're talking about, but
she's one in a million.
Yeah, for sure. And so was she similar in terms of like how?
Very. I mean, Orin had her own style, and still, I'm sure, has her own style, but. Yeah. There was that transition. It wasn't radical. I mean, I felt totally at home from the first moment I was with Orin. Orin would make you feel that way anyway. She's that kind of person. Mm-hmm. I just had dinner with her in the city with a whole bunch of retirees of the Met, and Tim Cobb was there. We had a wonderful evening. Oh, it was just a lovely, lovely evening.
Wow.
But she, so I studied with her. I also took coaching lessons at the same time with George Andre, who was principal of the Metropolitan Opera. Amazing player and amazing guy. I even, for jazz, I was fortunate enough to spend a little bit of time with Dave Holland, studying some jazz. Not even so much bass playing. I mean, he showed me some technique, but it was more so theory. I used to meet him at Barry Asholt's apartment down on Houston Street in the Village. And basically, we'd sit behind a piano and occasionally pick up a bass, But he too is masterful, And the truth is, I was so fortunate, being the background that I came from. Anybody that came into town, whether it was Bob Gladstone, whether it was Sam Hollingsworth, I got a coaching lesson. Or they take me to a performance, and I'd sit behind the bass section, watching them play, which was an education in themselves.
Wow.
Very fortunate.
Yeah, well, what a cool convergence of your father, say, getting into the business the way that you described, with figuring out how to fix the bow from his engineering background, and then Fred seeing that, and how did that evolve for your father? Like, how did he get from there to eventually making basses and getting into the business? Like did he go apprentice, or was it on his own learning?
It was mainly self-taught.
Yeah.
But I will pay homage to people that need to be paid homage. He did study a bit with Al Eisenstein, who was a great repairman in Manhattan. He was considered one of the top. And Al was very gracious. He allowed my father to sit at his side, watch him work. But a lot of it was self-taught. My father was a very ingenious person. He really would look at a problem and figure out 5 ways of doing it, and then choose the right way always. I mean, he really was a brilliant man. I mean, even my apprenticeship with him, it was really laid out. I mean, part of my music education was done. Sure, I could have gone off to play. That could have been a choice. I did play professionally for a while, but I felt that was part of my background to let me understand the instrument better in the shop here, and understand the sound, and understand I find it very hard, and I may have even said this before, that I find it hard for makers or restorers that can't play the instrument, that they rely upon other people to say, oh, this sounds good. You need to be able to play the instrument. You need to be able to understand the trials and tribulations that, players are going through.
Right. Well, and so I'm sure the thought of getting into the business like you have must have been in your mind during your younger years, and then while you were studying with all these people. I mean, when you were studying, let's say with Orin O'Brien, did you have in your mind that? Did you see yourself doing what you're doing now, being a part of the business, or did you think you were going to just play?
When I was with Orin at that point, when I got out of college, I basically made the decision my senior year that I was going to go back. At one point, to be honest with you, when I was in college, I went to transfer to Stevens Institute of Technology for marine architecture, because I always naval architecture really, to design ships and things like that. I had a background in that, but part of it, to be honest with you, was a deciding factor, because Vietnam War was going on, and you had to be a matriculating student. Right. And I had a choice of, going one semester there and then going right into the military. And I chose to stay where I was, and then chose to go with my father, and see what happens there. But I had the option. I mean, I played professionally. To this day, I'm still in 802. I still have my 802 card. I haven't done a gig in probably 30 years, but I played professionally for probably about 8 to 10 years until. It's the old adage, you can only dance at so many weddings, and it was too much. And I also felt that with the economy starting to change, I was taking work away from my clients. So I just decided this is where I belong in the shop. And the truth is, I feel like I'm a member of every orchestra. I feel like, I talk to everybody. And I feel like I'm a section member. Maybe I don't have everything that you don't have to put up with everything as a section member. But I learn about a lot of things that way, and I'm in touch with so many people, and I enjoy what I do. There's very few days I don't enjoy coming to work.
Yeah. Well, I got to ask about naval architecture. So was architecture something that you were interested in from a young age?
I always did drawings and things like that. And I grew up on the water. We were around boats. I was around boats my whole life. And it's really, when I went into Albany as a math major, and, so I had, technical background to some extent. And the truth is I in my second year, I happened to play also, I was a decent athlete. I played varsity lacrosse for Albany State, and I got accepted on a full-ride scholarship to Stevens Institute of Technology. And it's not because so much of my grades, I think it was more because I was a good lacrosse player. But I decided, for reasons not to go, and I finished up at Albany. I actually finished up there as a math and business major.
Well, all of these skills must have obviously then came to play a part in all the things you did later, and like that math background and that architecture interest, and then certainly the business knowledge running this business. That I can see the parallels between something like architecture and then instrument design and the logic and the skills.
There's definitely mathematics involved in instrument making. There's no question about it. I mean, you know what? I have kids come in here and they'll go off to school. And basically, I generally will tell anybody that goes off to, going as performance, go after your dreams, but also prepare yourself, because it's not always the easiest profession to pursue. And I'm a firm believer that in life, you pick up as much knowledge as you can. Those are your armament in life, and you put them in your back pocket. You may never have to draw upon it, but it's a nice thing to have. And the same thing with this, it's what I picked up in my education, was a good thing. Do I draw upon everything? No, but I mean, like anything in life, to be successful is a little bit of street savvy and also, also common sense. But it's good to have that knowledge to fall back upon. And I really encourage, young people to do that. I mean, I think the more knowledge you can have, it's even studying instruments or studying bass or studying violin or whatever. I am a firm believer the more teachers you can study with, the better, because no teacher is going to teach you how to play. They're going to give you the tools to equip yourself and develop your own, talents. But you're going to create your own style based upon who you're exposed to. So the more you're exposed to, the more depth you're going to have.
This episode is brought to you by Steve Swan String Bass, and I've always been impressed by how Steve manages to get basses sounding so vibrant, whether it's a student-level bass or a top-of-the-line professional bass. Here's Steve on some of what he has learned in terms of setup.
When steel strings came into general use around 1959, the German bass makers flipped out, and they really got scared that they're going to get big shiploads of basses back that got wrecked by these high-tension steel strings. And so they did three things that really changed the function of the instrument. They shortened the string length, and they lowered the neck angle so the bridges weren't that tall anymore. And then they made the tops a lot thicker. They really wanted to ensure that these basses were not going to come back across the ocean for work anymore. And so the basses tend to sound kind of nasal, and they didn't have any depth. They didn't have a chest voice at all. Yeah. And so what we do with increasing the neck angle, and we can also increase the overstands for modern playing, can get up into thumb position a lot easier. So a neck reset can accomplish that. Sometimes we'll transplant a neck or make a new neck for these basses that might have a string length that are not friendly to modern playing.
Learn more about what Steve can do to get your bass playing better, and check out his great selection of basses at steveswanstringbass.com. And thanks for sponsoring the podcast, Steve. Kolstein Music has been supplying the bass world and the music world in general at this point with great services and products for over 60 years. It was started by Samuel Kolstein and has been run by Barrie Kolstein, who I've had on the podcast, and they are just such a great company for anything you need for basses. They've got a great selection of instruments. They've got a great selection of bows, accessories, and just a great bunch of people working behind the scenes. Barrie has been a true friend to the bass community for so long, and it's so great to have Kolstein supporting the podcast. Learn more about everything that they do at kolstein.com.
It's really fun and exciting for me to see how you are definitely not resting on your laurels. You are like all these new, like, it's cool to see how you're continuing to innovate in terms of you've redesigned your trunk, for example, to trim some inches off here or there. Even little things like the Kolstein rosin, how it comes in that case that you can peel down. You know, I can't tell you how I show that to my students in San Francisco, and they say, why is my rosin on paper and I have to pull it, you know, or whatever material, like those kind of things. I mean, that's a small example, but or the Busetto bass, for example.
These are the fun things. I mean, you know what? When it comes to fruition and things are successful, that's the icing on the cake. You know, but getting to that point can be a lot of fun. You know, it's the I often say the silicon innovation was a 3 a.m. in the morning. It was kind of like, you know, from The Graduate with plastic, you know, that type of thing. It just came to me, you know, and I said, because, you know, there was always an issue of, you know, rosin melt ends. You know, once you took off you exposed the rosin, you know, oxidation, that rosin would dry out. And the silicon works like a charm. It's just a marvelous innovation, you know, and I pat myself a little bit on the back with that, but it just works, and that's the fun part about it.
It works great, and it's such a great material for holding the rosin and not because I mean that's the problem with any other material they use outside of it. You get it gunked up
silicon is fantastic because you know when we make our rosin, we're pouring that rosin at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which is quite hot.
Whoa!
You know, so I mean foil will work, you know, as far as pouring into it. But when you peel, we had foil cap on our rosin. When you peel it down, you've exposed the rosin. So if the temperatures heat up and the rosin melts, you have an issue. It's going to go all over unless you keep it in a container. With a silicone, not only do you roll it down, roll it up, and it's self-contained, but, you know, to be honest with you, it when you put the cap on it stops the oxidation, the drying process. The other factor that I tell people, which, you know, is probably not good for my business, is that, you know, if rosin, even with a Kolstein rosin, if you dry out a little bit, you can take that silicone container, put it into the microwave, you know, and just heat it up for 30 or 40 seconds and let it cool down, and you basically have a new piece of rosin again.
I have noticed. Well, it's interesting that you're talking like that's great to know. I haven't tried to microwave mine yet. I've microwaved other rosin before, but I haven't. But I do feel like that trapping in the silicone seems to keep it fresher longer.
I mean, you're sealing it out. You're basically sealing. Oxidation occurs when, you know, you have air hitting the surfaces.
Yeah.
Here with the rosin, the only surface that's going to be really exposed is your top surface. And once you roll up the silicone back up, and again, if you really feel that something's dried out, you put it in the microwave for a little bit, heat it up, let it cool down, and you basically have your rejuvenated rosin.
Yeah.
Not great for rosin sales, but it does work.
You make instruments. You do so many things, but you also restore instruments.
Yes, we do.
And we've talked about a few of them. But it seems to be like such a how do you even know what a bass comes in? Like it seems like just this giant puzzle to me. How do you even know where to start with restoring an instrument? That's kind of a wide question, but I mean, what are some of the challenges of doing that? What are some of the frustrations? What are some of the interesting things about it?
Well, the truth is with restoration, Probably the hardest part very often of restoration is undoing what other people have done. Because sometimes the work is not up to quality or not done properly. And basically you have to be very careful because you don't want to disturb the structural or any part of the integrity of that instrument in undoing. So, I mean, it's basically bringing it back to a stabilized situation and then restoring it. I mean, to be honest with you, I'll again digress a little bit. When I started with my father, the first 3 to 4 years, probably 3.5 years, I never touched a restoration. What he had me do was making new instruments, making these Panomo copies. I probably not completed, but roughed out probably maybe 30 to 40 instruments, maybe even more in that period of time. And why did he do that? First, he was smart because I still have stock on it. So I have a 45-year-old instrument that I'm making as a new instrument now. But aside from that, he felt it was the best way to learn tool skills. You're working in a pristine environment. You weren't undoing, working with things that were wrong and undoing, other people's work that wasn't done in a proper fashion. After that, then he brought me into the restoration aspect of it, which was done in a very smart fashion. It's basically, when you approach a restoration, sure, there's guidelines, but nothing is written in stone. Every instrument is different. It's basically you have to look at the problem and, again, analyze it, give your options, and then make a decision on the best option and hope for the best. We're generally very successful. We're not dealing necessarily with life and death. You're not on an operating table with a human being, but still you're dealing in a multifaceted venue, when you're doing restoration, and the fact that, not only are you restoring structurally this instrument back whole, but you also have to restore tonally. So it's a dual purpose. It's not just making the instrument look great or closing a crack, but you have to make certain that instrument functions. We're dealing, I've said it often, it's functional art. That's what we deal with. So, is there a set formula? No, but there are, I've done so many that there are ways you can look at a job and say, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to approach it. But you have to be very flexible at a moment's notice. Even if I'm not doing the work here, part of my job during the day is walking around and being a consultant for if some of my guys are doing some of the restoration, which they're very qualified, but they draw upon my knowledge, and I'm trying to give them my knowledge. Do I have all the answers? No one does. Anybody that says they have all the answers is either a liar or a fool, or maybe both. I don't know.
Well, what a great way that your father had setting you up and making the instruments and developing the tool skills and developing, doing what's right rather than undoing. That's such a great foundation to have, to then come in and that seems like a great way to go versus the opposite and not really understanding.
Well, it's a pristine way of learning tool skills. You're not contending with undoing problems that other people have caused or issues with an instrument. You're dealing with a clean piece of wood, and you learn how to work that wood. You learn how to work your tools. You learn, you get a motion that can carry on. I think my instruments, I'm very proud of what I do as far as my copies that I make today, that I specialize in today. And I think part of the success of that copy is the fact that I've spent so much time inside older instruments, working on masterful instruments that you can draw upon the success of these masters. The greatest thing in the world was when I go into an old instrument and you see, tool marks in there that were done by the master. It's almost like sitting at the maker's side. It's phenomenal. I love that. It's would it win, a competition? No, but to me, it wins every competition.
So coming up on 50 years in the business, and I go on the International Society of Bassists website, and I look up, I say, I want to do a Throwback Thursday post on something, and I go and I look for something Luther related, and what do I find? Barrie Kolstein, an article from 1995 or something, and I posted, and all these people like it, and then I look up another, and I see it. So you've been in this business, and you've been watching this for all these years. How has the bass world changed over those decades?
That's a good question. I I think it's changed, but it really hasn't. I mean, the talent is talent. I mean, I am frightened by some of the talent of the young people coming up today. I think, the Rex Saranis, Ted, who just got into the Metropolitan Opera. These are young guys that I think it's brilliant on the part of the orchestras to be bringing these young people in with so much talent. I think, I feel like, that the younger people have a reverence. I think the older people like myself, I think it's a duty on our part to keep some of the older players like Fred Zimmermann, like Milt Hinton, like Percy, their story alive, or Scotty LaFaro. I mean, I think it's very important to let these younger people know about them because they weren't privileged to be exposed. But there's so many great teachers that are out there today. I think the bass world, if anything, the levels have been lifted, but that's in everything in life. I mean, athletics today, if someone ran a 4-minute mile, it was incredible, and the same thing as a kid, if you played the Eccles Sonata, you were on the edge of your seat. Who could do that? Now it's a warm-up etude, it's like you're going to play that, that was the performance piece, So, I mean, and that's due to education. It's due to, motivation. It's due to, people writing, great literature that's being written. I mean, I think the world, and I pay homage to people like Gary Carr, like, some of the people that really made the world aware of what the bass is really about.
Yeah, and you're so right about that generation, like John Grillo, who we both know.
John, sure.
He passed along to me some of these Fred Zimmermann practice tapes, just some audio tracks of him practicing. He sounds fantastic.
Yeah.
So they're great players, and the level continues to rise. But there was great playing when you were starting out in the business, when you were studying with these people. I mean, that's top-notch bass playing.
It was, and I think, obviously a Beethoven symphony is a Beethoven symphony.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's played right, it was played beautifully back then, and it's played beautifully, executed properly today as well. But I mean, I think the literature overall, I mean, the bar has been risen, has definitely been taken up several notches for players today.
Yeah. Well, celebrating Kolstein music, Kolstein & Sons, 75 years. Almost 50 years for you in the business.
Almost.
And it was 10 years ago or over 10 years ago since we chatted for this. And I appreciate it. You know what? I didn't ask this when we were chatting with John because I didn't have any final kind of question I asked, but I do now, which is just go back to, you can pick the age, but somewhere around 18-year-old Barrie, and give him some advice. Now, all these years later.
Oh gosh. You know what? I think as an 18-year-old and, or even in my early 20s coming into the shop, everything like that, a lot of it was laid out for me. There was a plan, that I was given a plan, which I often say I've done a good job and I'm proud of what I've done with the shop, and I continue to be proud. But, I was given an opportunity, and I always respect self-made people, that weren't given that opportunity. It's what you do with the opportunity. Yeah. But I think if anything I would say to myself is that there are periods in that 50 years that seem to have faded by. And I think if I was to do anything, I would say, slow the vehicle down a little bit and enjoy the flowers, as they say. It's not that there's areas that, whether it be in the shop, whether it be clients, whether it be, even, my family, my kids, my grandkids now, I've learned to really try to take in as much as you can. Yeah. When you're young, it's hard to always look at that. It's easy to be a Monday morning quarterback, as they say. So probably if I was to say something to the younger Barrie, I'd probably say, slow it down at times. Don't be so, don't have that, that motivation as strong as what it was, and just sit back and enjoy life, a little bit more, So, in certain periods. Mm-hmm. I mean, I have a great life. I really do, and hopefully, it's, I have a lot more to go.
Right,
but,
right.
But yeah, that'd probably be the only thing I'd say. I don't have the route that I took to get where I am today. I'm really happy with that. I'm very proud of it. I don't have any regrets. I've met so many great people. I mean, including yourself.
Hey.
And more people to learn, to meet. I mean, there's so many young people coming up that I'm excited about. So,
Barrie, pleasure.
Jason, wonderful.
Barrie, thanks so much for sitting down and chatting. And folks, if you haven't checked out the first conversation that we put out on the podcast, definitely do that. It's great, and it's a very detailed look at the history of the company. But what fun to go and actually see the shop, and Barrie gave me a great tour of the shop, and I got to see in person everything that they're up to. They are continuing to innovate. Barrie's continuing to innovate, and it's just so great to see what Kolstein, both Barrie and Sam and the company have done for the bass community over the years. It's really great. And Barrie is such a good-hearted guy, and he's done so much for the bass community, like giving away a bass at the ISB convention. I remember seeing him getting called up on stage at the ISB 2017 convention, and he was so reluctant to come up on stage. It was so great. We finally got him on stage, and the audience just thunderous applause. So yeah, wow. Thanks again, Barrie, for everything you do. And thank you for listening. I really appreciate it. Maybe you've been listening for years. Maybe you're new. Regardless, thanks for being on this journey with us. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, it's free, and you can do it in a lot of different ways. And you can find out how to do that at contrabassconversations.com/subscribe. And while you're there, get on our email list. We've got many thousands of bass players worldwide that we communicate with that way. So I'd love to have you on the journey of this crazy show, both in terms of listening to the podcast, following with the email list, and just connect with us wherever you hang out. If it's Facebook or Twitter or whatever, we are there, and we'd love to connect with you. And it's not just me. You know, we've got a whole team doing this podcast, and that team is Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. Mitch puts together these episodes, and he also puts together beautiful basses. He's a luthier in the Dallas area. Learn more at mitchmooring.com. Beautiful new website, by the way. And thank you to Krista Copper for going through and cataloging and archiving all the topics we talk about on this show. Unbelievable service. So thank you to everybody on the team, as well as you, the listener. We would not be doing this show without you. I'm your host, Jason Heath, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.